Then I will say good morning to everyone and welcome to this webinar, the first webinar from the Global African Swine Fever Research Alliance, GARA. So this is, most of you know, that this is an alliance which was launched at Plum Island in New York in 2013. And in response to the threat posed by African swine fever to pig farmers worldwide. And the aim of this alliance is to establish and sustain global research partnerships that will generate scientific knowledge and tools to contribute to the successful prevention, control, and where feasible, eradication of African swine fever. And one of the activities of GARA is to organize biannual scientific meetings where we have a scientific conference and a gap analysis. And this year we were supposed to have the 5th such meeting in Uganda, in Kampala, Uganda. But due to as you all know, due to the COVID situation, we had to postpone the meeting. First, we postponed it until August. So it was supposed to start tomorrow. But of course, the situation is still complicated. And then we decided to organize a webinar instead to keep the momentum going until next year when we will have the meeting, but also to update the scientific community about what is happening worldwide as regards African swine fever. And today we have 3 presentations updating on the situation in the different continents where the disease is prevailing. So this morning we have Professor Dirk Pfeiffer, who is the Chow Tak Foong Chair Professor of One Health at the City University at Hong Kong, but at the same time the Professor of Epidemiology at the RBC in London, and also Adjunct Professor at China Animal Health and Epidemiology Center in Qingdao in China. So Dirk has been working with African swine fever since very many years on issues relating to the disease in Africa, the disease in Europe, Russia, and now in Asia. So he's the perfect person to update us on this situation. And I'm very happy that you accepted to do that, Dirk. And because this is now a global webinar, so we have to take into account the time differences in the different countries. So now Dirk is in Hong Kong, and we have the webinar now in the morning, European time, and then this afternoon we will hear about the situation in Africa and Europe, and tomorrow we have webinars on virology, vaccinology, and diagnostics. So for the moment we have 73 participants, which is very good, and you're all very welcome. And I'm happy that you are here and listening to this. We have a few housekeeping rules. We would like all of you to have your mics muted. If you don't mute them yourself, I will mute them because I can see them from here. And then we after the presentation, we have time for some discussions or questions. And the best way is probably that you post the questions or you write the questions into the chat, and then we can read them, or we can ask you to take them after the presentation. This webinar will be recorded, so it will be available on the GARA website. All the presentations will be available. So I think that is all for me. So we'll give the floor the word to Dirk, and I will remove my picture. So welcome, Dirk.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Carl, and also thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk this afternoon my time and this morning your time, those of you that are in Europe or in Africa. I've been asked to give an update on the epidemiological situation of African swine fever in Asia, and I have to, right at the beginning, I have to say that it is my biased perspective. So it's a big place. There are many countries. It's a very complex situation. And what I will do is during the next 45 minutes, they're giving me 1 hour. I'm very lucky, I've got 1 hour. But we'll need about 45 minutes to give you an overview from my perspective of the current situation, some of the developments, and I'll present some of the studies that we've been involved in. I've got a rough structure. Oh, in fact, it's not rough really. I've got a structure to my talk. So I'll start off with a little bit of context, a few slides. Then I will talk about pork food systems, because I think that is a key aspect of this disease. I mean, if we don't understand the complexities or the factors associated with those systems and the drivers of infection that are linked to the pork food systems, I don't think we can actually control the disease. I have a couple of slides about the epidemiology, and then I'll touch on a number of areas which are relevant to disease emergency management, and that's just to emphasize the importance of risk assessment. Again, as many of you know, but I mean, maybe not all of you do, I will show the use of modeling for human communication purposes. And then I'll also present a compartmentalization activity that I've been involved in, and explain the utility that that approach hopefully will have in countries that are at risk of becoming infected. I have a couple of slides where I've listed some of the challenges and that we have to deal with, and I'm not claiming that I know about all of them. So again, that's quite a biased perspective, and then I'll finish off with 2 slides of conclusions. So let's get on with it. So the context, and I mean, I show this with all of my presentations about African swine fever or anything that happens in this part of the world, and it's just to remind people around the world of the fact that 50% of the world's population actually live inside that circle. And that plays a very important role when it comes to emergence of diseases, whether they're infectious diseases such as COVID, but also when it comes to something like African swine fever, which once it didn't emerge here, it came from elsewhere, it came from Europe most likely. But within that highly dense human population, even though it's not a zoonosis, okay, but high human population density also is connected to high density of the host population. I'll come back to that later. The other thing is economic development. Okay, so that's all that slide is showing, and we see Vietnam as the orange line here, and the China as the gray line, and this is looking at pig meat consumption per person per year from 1999 to 2027. So it's a prediction, obviously the last 7 years or 6 years, and this maps the kilogram per day per person per year. And I mean, really, I mean, just to show to you a lot of people in this part of the world, and as a consequence of economic development, which is a wonderful thing, of course. People have more disposable income and they want to eat meat. And if they want to eat meat in this part of the world, they have, which is why I'm showing this, but they have a preference for pork meat. So if you look at, this shows you the animal protein calories by food source, by key region in percent, and you take Vietnam up here, you can see that blue bar here, section here, is what represents pork. So in Vietnam, it's incredibly important, as it is in China. And as you can see here in India, it's of very little significance. So that will drive pork production, intensity of pork production, and I have to say also the future trajectory of that production density. So that's the background. I mean, it's, as always, it's driven by consumer demand. So let's look at the pork food systems. And when we look at it from a global perspective, this is just to emphasize the clustering of pig production intensity. So this shows you the density of pigs per, I forgot what it was, per square kilometer or whatever it was. And the peaks indicate how much higher intensity than anything that is actually in green on there. So it's not evenly distributed, it's not randomly distributed. In fact, it's highly clustered. And particularly when you come to East Asia, Southeast Asia, you've got this particular area which has an enormously high density of pigs. In fact, it used to have about, whatever the figures are, 50 to 60% of the world's pig population. Now, homing in on China, I mean, another characteristic of that pork food system is that, at least in 2016, and the structure will be changing now or has already changed, the vast majority of those, 98% of the pigs were, or farms were kept by small farms up to 100 pigs. We're talking here about 41 million farms. That's a lot of farms. As I've said, as a consequence of African swine fever, that is changing and that is shifting further down to the larger farms. Yeah, so this is, I guess, the reflection of that situation. So we've got I mean, one always has to kind of wonder about how accurate those numbers are. In 2015, the total number of pigs around the world, and in black, we've got the percentage, or in this case, the number of pigs which are kept in China. And as you can see here, 2019, 2020, it went down considerably, whereas it didn't in the other parts of the world. So that change has been enormous and had enormous consequences, not just in terms of having a disease spreading around, but from a consumer's perspective and from a producer's perspective, this has been a very significant development. And one of them is the pork price. Because, I mean, that's what matters in the end, though. It's what the consumer has to pay and is prepared to pay. So on this graph here, the blue line up here shows you the price in US dollars per kilogram of live pigs. And I mean, you just look at it, it doubled actually from Chinese New Year, around Chinese New Year in 2019. It doubled from about, say, $2 US per kilogram up to 5 to 5.5. And it's fluctuated a little bit around that level here, but it's been at a level of factor 2 for some time. Just to illustrate the difference here, and I've also shown as the yellow, the red, and the green line show you the fluctuation in the live pig price per kilogram for some selected countries, and it's Brazil, one region of Spain, and Belgium, which has been fairly stable. It's fluctuated, but it's been fairly stable. There has been no comparison with the situation in China. And these countries, apart from Belgium, also haven't had African swine fever, of course. Now, what that does is, and I think this is a very useful quote here, it actually, this Genesis in May 2020, they wrote, the average profit per slaughter pig is US dollars 236 in China, with the net profit being up to 38 times compared to what it was pre-African swine fever. So raising pigs has become the most profitable industry in the first quarter in China. So this is this year. So this is a very important factor. We've got a disease that has resulted in a big reduction of the pig population. Pork price has gone up, and those which are still in business, they're making a lot of money. And these are just in fact, this shows you the, I think it's 32 largest pig producers in the world, and it indicates the number of sows in 2020, okay? So you've got the ones which are from China are shown in yellow here, and there are quite a number of them in that category. So we've got Wens, which is now up to, in fact, the number, I think 2 years ago was around 600,000, somewhere around there. And now it's above 1.2 million sows. That's a lot of pigs, okay? And where you are on foodstuffs, very similar situation. They actually in 2018 they had around 600,000, maybe 700,000, maybe 800,000, according to this particular statistic here. And so there's an opportunity to make money, and there's nothing wrong with making money, but it will influence the future trajectory of the pork industry in this part of the world. Okay, now the other thing that I want to remind you of is that we do have a lot of, and that's particularly important to see for those who come from Europe or the parts of Europe that I originally come from, that we have a lot of wet markets and butcher shops in this part of the world. And you can see some of the behaviors here, the lady touching the meat with her hands, and you can see just the general hygiene is one could argue suboptimal. So that is also something that plays a role in the epidemiology of this disease in this part of the world. And that's not just the fact that it might be an opportunity for spread of African swine fever, okay, and whether that is through meat going back onto farms for as feed as well. But it's also, we have a lot of people whose livelihoods depend on selling pork, on trading pork. Okay, let's talk a little bit about epidemiology here. And I just want to show a map. And this is fairly up to date, actually, up until last week. And we can see the epicenter of African swine fever according to the statistics that are, this comes from FAO Empress-I, which is populated primarily by data from the OIE, so reported outbreaks to the OIE. So since 2007, when the genotype 2 moved into or arrived in Georgia, we've had a lot of outbreaks in Europe or in Eurasia, or let's say the western part of Eurasia. And as green stars, you see wild boar, a lot of them also wild boar, and red domestic swine. Africa, very limited reporting. And when you go to Asia, I mean, we have, in fact, the background that you see is, I should say, in brown. The darker the brown, the higher the density of domestic pigs. So you've got clusters of high density up there. These are the peaks that I showed you on the previous map. So we actually don't have a lot of reports of outbreaks in China here. We had lots of outbreaks in Vietnam, a couple of wild boar, and more recently we've had actually, and I have to say the last 2 months, we've had quite a number of wild boar outbreaks in Russia at the border to China. And then I'll talk a little bit later about the situation in the Republic of Korea. And then, as you can see here, so we've had outbreaks in the Philippines and in a couple of other countries in Southeast Asia. So this is, by the way, the situation in 2020, which I think is devastating when you think about it. The map from the previous one, which was cumulative, looks, there are more dots on there, but actually it doesn't suggest that we are getting that disease under control here. It still is present in more or less the same locations, and instead it is actually expanding the areas where it occurs. Okay, so this is just, you've seen this before, high density of pigs, and just keep that at the back of your mind. Now, within that, we've got a very complicated system here, and this is a little bit of an easy picture, though. But I mean, I just thought I'd show it to emphasize why it is so difficult to control this virus. This virus survives so well in pork products and on clothing, or on trucks which are contaminated. So if stakeholders, the actors in that value chain or supply chain, do not take appropriate hygienic or biosecurity actions, the virus will not disappear. Whether you have wild boar in there or you don't, and that's another big question in relation to this part of the world. Now, in most of Europe, you just have that part of the production system here. That very much dominates. We don't have that bit here, but that's very common in Southeast Asia and in some of the East Asian countries, and makes it so much more complicated to control the disease. I'll just want to use this talk also to mention the wild boar. I mean, the habitat this is a map. We don't know the wild boar numbers in this part of the world. We can make predictions about, and these guys here, not we, I mean, these colleagues here make some predictions about where the habitat is suitable for wild boar. And I can tell you, we've got lots of wild boar here in Hong Kong. So anything that's a darker brown has lots of wild boar. And in terms of what you just saw before on the map with outbreaks, I mean, this is where these recent outbreaks occurred in wild boar. So we have definitely suitability of habitat. And I would argue we must have quite a number of wild boar in this part of the world, but very little information about the presence of the disease in these species. This is just showing you the situation in Hong Kong, I mean, which is obviously not representative for this part of the world. But it also indicates why we need to be so careful. I mean, that they live in urban, they get used to urban situations, they benefit from them, they find their feed there, etc. So we need to watch this one. Just a little bit about, I mean, I mentioned earlier, I mean, I was going to mention the situation in South Korea, because, I mean, this is, we've got very good data about the outbreak that occurred in September 2019, when 14 pig farms were eventually affected between September and October. And one has to the credit of the veterinary services in Korea, South Korea, and they brought it under control amongst those farms. But since then, and this is, you can see here on the map, this is North Korea up here, this is South Korea, so it's along the border to North Korea. And in dark brown, you've got density of pig farms, predicted density. The red dots are the pig farms which were affected, should be 14, and the green stars are the wild boar cases that have been reported since October 2019. So a big number. I mean, not that it has actually spread much around the country here. You see the odd case. There's 2 in pig farms during that first phase of at the beginning, and there's been seem to have been some jumps in wild boar. Now, what we've done is we've actually worked together with the Animal and Plant Quarantine Agency in South Korea, and looked at the first phase. We wanted to understand, or they wanted to understand, what actually brought those disease, what brought that infection onto those farms? What was the relative importance of movement of vehicles? And because these guys, they have incredible data there. They have a GPS tracking system on every vehicle that's associated with livestock farming activities and moving around between farms. So we had that data. And we also had data about from the enhanced passive ASF surveillance in wild boar that was conducted after the outbreak occurred. And one of the observations was, and so you can see here, the red dots are actually the density of farms in general. The yellow dots are these infected pig herds, and the green dots are the, I think there were a couple, I've forgotten how many there were, yeah, 26 wild boar carcasses which were found up until October 2019, and therefore could have been a source of infection. So there was a substantial number of potentially contaminated vehicle movements between farms despite early detection and movement restriction. So this is the other thing, keep in mind, these guys, they were very quick on the job, and still though there had been quite a number of movements. And there were, by the way, these black dots here are non-infected properties which were linked via movement, vehicle movement to the IPs, but that didn't have, follow-up was done, that didn't have an outbreak. Okay, this is just zooming into the area, so let's just move on. So as during the analysis, basically what we figured out was there was one part in the area, so, and that is here on the right, where we had 2 clusters in wild boar, and the farms in that area, some of them were actually, pig farms were connected to those, and that might have been the source of infection. Whereas there was another cluster here where wild boar did not play a role here, and the analyses demonstrated that the introduction must have been through the movement of vehicles. The source of the outbreak is most likely to have been an infected wild boar on one of the farms, I mean the IP1, which is that one here. And it's still not understood whether that was a wild boar coming from across the border, having swum through the water, or what it was. The bottom line, though, is, I mean, it kind of emphasizes here we have a very good surveillance system, a very good ability to respond, and still the wild boar situation is not under control. It's very difficult to get under control, but they have been able to stop it very clearly. Have been able to stop it very effectively in domestic pig farms. So the interventions have to be at the farm-to-farm connections, about the movements between them, and the biosecurity that's associated with those movements, but also as a source of introduction, the possibility for wild boar to come into contact with, or even workers that might be the vehicle for transmitting or taking the virus from an area where there are wild boar onto a farm. But clearly those 2 things need to be considered. Okay, now let's just talk a little bit about disease emergency management. And I don't want to, this is sort of motherhood and apple pie stuff, but I think it's still, every country needs to have a good emergency management practice plan for dealing with African swine fever. I can't emphasize that important enough. When they need to test it, okay, they need to use it. And that's about prevention, detection of the disease, response to the disease, and recovery. Don't forget about the recovery. You have to be prepared for or any of those activities. A key role within that is played by risk assessment, and we need to have the capacity in the countries to be able to do that. And I'll talk to you in a couple of slides about how our involvement with that. Surveillance for early detection are the key tools for being in there, as they did really well, where they did really well in South Korea, and they also conducted very competent epidemiological outbreak investigations, which generated very useful data that allowed responding effectively and stopping it. That requires staff that has been trained in conducting these. On the basis of that information, one can then decide what response to use. Okay, let's talk a little bit about risk assessment. I don't think I have to go through the detail. It's the probability of estimating. So you're estimating the risk of African swine fever through a range of different mechanisms. It's trying to make it more objective, rather than sitting around a table and saying this factor is important or that one. And every country is different to an extent. There's similarities, but the relative importance of what we call the risk pathways is very likely to vary. And there definitely are big differences between the situation in Europe, Africa, and Asia. But even amongst Asian countries, there are similarities, but there are also differences. You just take South Korea, situation will be very different from, say, Vietnam. So we need to have local expertise to be able to describe this effectively. And then on the basis of that, you can develop your policies. I would argue, without having done a structured risk assessment, which also have to be refined because these systems are changing, it's hard to come up with effective policies. So to be able to do that, I need to understand how this stuff is being traded, because this is an example value chain for a pork food system in a country or region. And I have to say, the relative importance of these different sections here or along the horizontal vary between countries. But they are there in most of the low to middle income countries in this part of the world. And each of those factors plays a role in allowing continued spread of the virus. It can go through that whole system and then come back at the other end. That's what makes it so hard to control. And if I want to control it, I need to have appropriate measures in place that cut the transmission chain in these different sections. I need to understand which are the most important ones so I can be effective there. And the trouble with that is you're dealing with lots of people. Okay, you're dealing with lots of stakeholders, not necessarily making a lot of money out of this here. Why should they then invest into biosecurity? They feel threatened by any risk management measures, etc. So I need to have an understanding of that. And again, that requires local knowledge. I would not. I can make some claims about understanding how the situation is in Hong Kong, but I couldn't about other countries in the region. Okay, now, yeah, and I guess so. With that in the background, you need to think about the risk factors for introduction of the disease to a pig farm, and then you map that into, which I'll show you. And this is now that you know about this stuff, I don't have to show you that. You map that into a risk pathway diagram. And like I said before, the key here is I've got imports from other countries. I've got trade within the country. I've got the neighboring farms, okay, connections with them. I've got food, okay, the processing and the consumption. I've got wild boar, and all of those potentially could take, well, any of those, there could be a connection to a pig farm that introduces the disease. And that needs to be understood, and there measures need to be put into place to either detect the disease early and ideally prevent it from arriving on that farm or circulating within that system. But I don't, so what we are doing is we've actually we've been awarded a contract by the OIE where we will work with countries in the region. Very ambitious, and I look forward to it. We'll have focal points in virtually every Southeast Asian country, in China, Timor-Leste, and Papua New Guinea, and work with them on coming up with anti-risk assessments. This is about the virus coming into the country, even though, I mean, many of these countries already have the virus, but we want to train them in the methodology so that they can then, I mean, that skill will be useful for African swine fever risk management, but also for other diseases. And we'll also develop guidelines which can be then used by others. Okay, that project runs until about June or middle of next year. Okay, let's just do, I just want to show you a little bit of the modeling work that we've done. We've actually developed a tool, and this was because I realized, I mean, the problem with mathematical models is they've been so abstract, and the people that have to use the results that are generated by those models, they're often intimidated by them. And what we've done is we've developed a tool that is available on the internet for free called Epidemics. And we produced a paper which is peer-reviewed to make sure that the algorithms behind the model are actually sound. And it allows you to model any disease, okay? But because I realized how important this methodology and how useful it can be to also convince stakeholders about some of the key factors that make it so challenging to deal with this disease. We've developed one part that actually focuses on African swine fever. It's a very simple model, okay? The assumptions are documented. Here you can see, and you can actually change the settings if you don't like if you don't agree with them, based on published literature. And we've got the references up here. You can actually click on that and you can see what they're based on. So one thing that I wanted to use it for here in my talk is I just wanted to illustrate the importance of farmers detecting there's something wrong. And this is actually quite neat here. We can use it if we take, for example, so we're saying, okay, what is it that the farmer might see? So what you see on this slide here, we have a farm with 100 pigs, okay? And it assumes homogeneous mixing, somewhat simplistic, still. So, and what you see here, those two lines are the bluish line are the infectious symptomatics. So they would have clinical disease, okay? And the farmers might see that, okay? And dead pigs, of course. And by day 15, on average, we expect there to be about 3 dead pigs and 2 infectious symptomatic pigs. I would argue many of these farms, they have lots of mortality anyway. So would they really notice that? Would they notice that change? And we'll be talking about 15 days, 2 weeks after introduction to the herd. So it's actually quite late. So what does that mean? This actually means that up until that time, there have been, on average, 21 infectious pig days. That is actually virus present in the farm and people coming, visiting the farm, vehicles getting onto the farm, etc., potentially taking the virus elsewhere. And that makes it, that's so scary. It could even be up to 63 or as little as 3. And I think that is so important to remember. That's what makes this virus so hard to control. If we think that the farmer might actually detect 2 symptomatic pigs or 1, and that would be by day 10, which I think is incredibly ambitious, quite frankly, the situation looks a bit better, okay? So this is something that is manageable. So here we are, realistically, it'll take 2 weeks until the farmer sees what's going on. So and I think this is, for decision makers, it will be useful to see that dynamic that actually drives has to drive our response and emphasizes the importance of early detection, but also explains why it's so hard to achieve that. So that was modeling. I wasn't going to talk much about prevention because prevention really means you have to go into that system and enhance biosecurity, okay? It's a lot about biosecurity and behaviors that increase risk. What is, for example, feeding or food waste? Okay. So, and we know about that. I don't think hygiene within markets and so on farms and so on. Trucks, cleaning of trucks, disinfection of trucks. I mean, anyway, but that's nothing new. Let's talk about compartmentalization. And this is where it's Asia, applicable in Europe, in Africa, elsewhere. And just some rules here, just the difference between zones, they often get confused. Zones are spatial, okay? It's a part of a country. that is defined by the veterinary authority as having a animal population with a certain health status. Compartments are animal populations which are separated by a common biosecurity management system from the surrounding areas. And they have sufficient surveillance and biosecurity control measures, which means that they are able to keep that health status. So as an example, just pictures are useful. So up here, we've got a zone that's free from African swine fever, and they can trade as long as the trading partner accepts that. But I must have a credible biosecurity border to the part of the country that is infected, which cannot trade. Compartment is a production unit within a country, and there may be infection in that country or not, but the trading partners, if it's used for trade, they accept the fact that that production unit is effectively separated from any risk that's associated with the surrounding population. And obviously that's driven by pork industry economic benefits. I mean, this is quite expensive. It has to be economically justified. It's about business continuity in particular. So if I'm in a currently disease-free country and I want to continue to export if disease came into the country, that would be a situation where one might want to invest into setting up a compartment. Okay, I mean, we've been contracted by the OIE to actually design some or develop some guidelines, and this is the ad hoc group that's been supporting us with this work, and I just wanted to show you the principles. So the key question with the compartment is, and here's my potential compartment there in the middle, okay, which has got a slaughterhouse and then processing plant. Doesn't have to have all those components, but in my example, that's what it is. Okay, several sections in there. I've got inputs from outside the compartment, but for those that actually are taking the outputs from the compartment, and in this case, it's pork products, they need to want to know what's the probability that pork products from this compartment are contaminated with viable ASF virus. And to be clear, that probability is never zero, okay? This is just impossible. I mean, wherever you are, I mean, it's probably close to zero in most situations if there is no disease in the country, no infection in the country. But still, this is another principle of risk assessment. So what we're trying to do here now is we need to, based on that, okay, we need to work backwards. So what's happening here is then, so they need to do risk assessment, the company or people that work with them, and look at how could the virus come in. So same as what I showed you before about the country, how could it come in? What are the most important pathways? Is it through movement of staff? Is it through feed? Is it through health supplies? Is it through pigs? What is it? Is it trucks moving around? Okay. Is it the slaughterhouse being also used by farms which are outside the compartment? Very tricky situation. So once I've done that risk assessment, I can then think about, so here are my pathways here, so the different ways how the virus could potentially come in. And I now need to design my biosecurity program. Okay, number one, biosecurity. What can I do to make sure it doesn't come in? How do I isolate that compartment with the potential for virus being in the surrounding population? How do I, and this is what the customer wants to know, the people that take your product, they want to make sure, given that the risk is not zero, never is zero, how effective is my surveillance? So if the virus comes in at one end, what's the probability that the pork product that the customer gets here might be infected? They want credibility that that's been done to it such that there's enough early warnings so that the pork products are unlikely to actually, highly unlikely to actually be contaminated with the virus. So that just showing that again. So this is what's the picture. We've got the situation where ideally you should set this up before there has been African swine fever in the country, but you could also do this once it's in the country. So though, I mean, it would be much easier to do it before. Now, let's say the virus comes into the country, will you be able to keep it out from that farm? Do you have the biosecurity measures in place? And then, like I said, the product that you're selling as well, will that be acceptable? The risk that's still associated with, will that be acceptable to the partners that we are working with that are taking your product? So I think I see a lot of potential for these compartments, and the big farms, the mega producers, are definitely looking into this option here. It's obviously, it has to be, you cannot put it this way, this is also useful if you just want to minimize the losses that an introduction would of the virus would cause for your herd. Almost there, just a couple of challenges here. And as I say, it's a very biased list here. So one is, how do you encourage farmers to report? And this is financial. I mean, I always say, if you pay compensation, you either pay too little or you pay too much. If you pay too much, people want to have the disease. If you pay too little, they don't tell you. It's so important to understand the implications that any detection and the response that you are then initiating has on the stakeholders who might lose their job. Okay, the actors or the people down the value chain, the traders, the butchers, the sellers, they will have nothing to sell during the time when you're shutting down trade after you've detected an outbreak. So this needs to be kept in mind. Illegal vaccine use, because farmers are desperate, right? and they are looking for opportunities to help them, and there are some pretty effective salespeople out there. So there are rumors around the illegal vaccine use in the region, and that's very scary actually, and we need to work together to minimize the chance of that happening. There's a lot of talk about farmers are devastated by the culling of their farms and the ability not to, I mean, they may get their compensation very late and then they can't restock quickly enough and they go out of business to do something different. But it has an enormous effect on the livelihoods. So in China, there's some of the big farms have developed something they called the tooth extraction method. And I'll show you one slide of a paper that they've used where they believe they can actually selectively, using PCR testing, they can identify which animals are infected, and they can just focus the culling on those animals. I think we need to be open-minded about this. We need to look at these alternatives objectively, okay, scientifically, but we shouldn't discount them. Because I mean, in parts of the world where the disease is endemic, we haven't got an alternative. We can't go in there and cull all the animals, and it's just too expensive, and it's a waste also of animal protein. Wild boar question, I've said it before. I mean, it's unfortunately, I mean, a lot of the time we hear, no, we haven't got them, and we don't think the infection is in there. Well, we do know if it gets into wild boar populations, it's very difficult to control. Slaughterhouse biosecurity. I actually think this is also one of the hardest parts. For anybody who's been to slaughter, I was recently at a slaughterhouse here in Hong Kong. It's so difficult to ensure that the trucks are doing what they're supposed to do. What are they? I mean, it costs them money. It takes time. So the chances are that people will cut corners, and if they cut corners, the virus will take advantage. Illegal meat trade. I mean, the pork price has meant it's actually an opportunity to make money. So there are operators who find ways of getting access to meat and moving into countries in the region. And then the question of safe restocking, which is important for the farmers, of course. So this is an example of the test, what I meant, the tooth extraction method. And by the way, I mean, what they're saying is that they were washing, disinfecting, and baking the trucks, okay, in a truck washing facility at 56 degrees Celsius for 70 minutes. Wow, I wonder how long the trucks survived that. But anyway, I mean, so they've been using PCR techniques to selectively cull infected animals from within farms. And their experience is, and this is what they reported here, is that it worked. So there were clear economic benefits. This is this story about the meat, so the price being high, so there's a lot of illegal trade, or a lot, there is significant trade, and that obviously bears a risk with it. And then the question of wild boar, this is from Russia. I mean, I'm not saying, I mean, we saw Republic of Korea, clearly they play a role, and they've been able to isolate the pig farm successfully from the wild boar. We need to look at that in more detail in other countries in the region. And what worries me is the information, the new reports from the Russia close to the border of China. So I cannot imagine that wild boar are completely irrelevant in these countries. Okay, so just a couple of conclusions. Nothing new here. I mean, it's not like you have to tailor to the local system. That means the people in the country need to have the capacity, the ability, and the training, but also the number of people and the connection to the industry to understand how the pork food system works. And that's not what veterinarians classically do. So we need to train and increase awareness. Low biosecurity farms are a big problem, and we have to be careful here because they're small farms often. They haven't got much money. They haven't got the money to invest into better hygiene. But it's important for these people's livelihoods. It's not a matter of just shutting all those farms down. We need to think of smart ways of how we can reduce the risk of African swine fever spread through those farms. That's a very tough call, I have to say. Big farms do play a role, but I mean, it's about, it's in their business interest to keep the disease out. Yeah, and we all want the vaccines and we're getting closer. I mean, there's some promising signs. It'll still be months or years off, but that will still not be the answer. I mean, you will not get enough vaccination coverage to be able to stop that virus from spreading. So it will be an important tool, but it won't be the single solution to solving the problem. Last slide. So, like I said, you need to have an ASF emergency management plan. You need to also simulate tests, yeah, so that the people involved know what they're doing. Partnership with the pork industry is so key. This disease depends on the commitment of the industry. Small, medium, large. And I think that's where there are some big issues in many countries, because the government is seen as one party and the industry is on the other side. They need to work together. Compartments will only work if you've got the industry and government coming together, but it needs to be initiated by industry partners. Early detection is key, and like I showed you, I mean, this thing can take a week or longer until the farmer sees it, so that's really scary. Sound epidemiological outbreak investigation is the basis of what you're going to do next. Good tracing, and you see this with COVID now. It's hard work, it's resource intensive. Maybe if you've got a large outbreak, you haven't got the people to do that properly. But it's what you need, and which is what they did in South Korea, with admittedly a fairly small number of cases. And then what you're going to do in terms of response. It's not just taking the standard ones from the textbook. They need to be tailored to the local situation. They need to take account of the socioeconomic situation that you have there. And it needs to be reevaluated. Does it work? Did it work? And adapted. And countries are learning. I think that we are developing a way of dealing with it. But I mean, my fear is it will be that we will end up living with the disease rather than, because it seems impossible, rather than eradicating it, which means it will continue to be a source of infection for other parts of the world, as Eastern Europe has been and is. Recovery, restocking policies, lots of questions asked about that. Pork price, I mean, in the end, it's about pork price. That's an important factor. It can also be an incentive to do something, but also sometimes maybe to do nothing because people are making a lot of money. Farmers here in Hong Kong, they are getting twice as much for their pigs than they did before African swine fever. We haven't got African swine fever yet, so for them, it's not been a disadvantage. But are they investing that additional money into improving biosecurity on their farms? I'm not sure about that. Structure of the industry is important. Should we, backyard farming, discourage that? I don't think it should be all about mega farms. We need to think about how we can keep the medium-size, large farms free from the disease. Very tough call, and that's where vaccines probably come in. And then finally, yeah, industry structure again. I mean, the prevention story, biosecurity behaviors. I mean, there not needs to change there. But how can you do that with people that are not making a lot of money out of it? The small scale farmers that haven't got the education and to understand what's required. I think we should consider compartmentalization. We need to test it. And admittedly, it looks like this is only for big farms of rich guys who've got lots of money. But we need to test it. And I think from that experience, we need to adapt it to other situations. I'm loath to test it in small scale, medium farms. I mean, I think it needs to be professionally run so that we learn how to do this kind of thing and then adapt it to other kinds of socioeconomic situations. And do not forget about the welfare. I keep saying it. I am just so worried that we might end up with an unpleasant surprise hitting us once we have reduced the spread of amongst domestic pigs more successfully. And I shall stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for a very comprehensive and thought-provoking presentation. And I think many of these things are not only relevant for Asia, but also for other parts of the world, Africa and also parts of Europe. We have time for some questions, but before that, I realized that I forgot to thank Armanda Bastos and University of Pretoria for organizing this webinar. It has worked very well. And I also forgot to present myself. I'm Carl Stoll. I'm in this executive committee of GARA as one of the two scientific officers. And I'm also I'm based in Sweden at the National Veterinary Institute. But now we have time for some questions, and you can type them in, or you type your name into the chat, and then I will give you the word, depending on how many questions we'll have. So you're welcome with questions. And I can start maybe while you think about your questions. I was thinking about the future. What do you think? Do you think, maybe you talk about the compartmentalization, which I suppose is a way to live with this virus for long term. Is that what you see?
I think, I mean, I am, you know, I don't know. Yeah, that's what I see. I think I would say in the short to medium term, I think we have to live with this virus, and we have to be prepared for it to spread to other continents and other countries, like South America, for example. I just can't see how we can stop it.
No, I agree. We have a question from Aaron Young from New Zealand. Please, Aaron.
May I able to speak?
Yeah.
May
Yes.
I able to speak?
Yes.
Okay, good. So Dirk, I know you didn't really focus about the diagnostic test of African swine fever, but I'm curious about it. Like, so currently, what diagnostic tests are available to detect the infection, and how good they are? How good are they?
I mean, as you said, I'm not really the person to ask that question, but I can give you. I mean, there are PCR tests which are very good. Actually, they're pretty good. And I'm going to put it this way, I'm even a little bit worried about, but they're also serological tests. The PCR is for early detection. Serological actually becomes, it's kind of whether you can use them to detect whether there has been exposure. Now, it is actually I don't know, maybe a little bit like with COVID. I mean, you end up with, I am actually a little bit worried about widespread use of these tests also by industry. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but I mean, I kind of, because these methodologies, and I'm not the expert, okay, they require lab skills, and you have to know how to interpret them. And I just wonder whether by them being used everywhere, because it's interesting, when you meet with big industry people, and I know that from China, you see, where they use the test and they find the virus everywhere. Okay, whether that's in the restaurant, a local restaurant, and on people. Okay, well, I mean, I'm not saying that that's not a correct result, but I am a little bit worried about what is then being done with that. Okay, so it requires a good test. There's good technology. It needs lab quality standards. Okay, which exist, and they need to be applied everywhere, and it needs an epidemiological interpretation. And by them being used everywhere, I am slightly worried. Okay, so, but I mean, maybe I'm too pessimistic, and maybe because there are many alternatives, so stakeholders feel that they have to take things into their own. Yeah, I mean, have to deal with them themselves. That's whether. Then even here, you know, in Hong Kong, we've been approached by farmers who wanted to use the diagnostic test, and that's scary. Anyways,
yeah,
sorry.
so I thought that's sort of the surveillance program. So I think the early detection of the infection is so important to control the spread of the virus. But I'm wondering, like, how early can they detect the infection? For example, you don't.
Oh, very quick, a few days.
A few days.
Aaron, just if I interrupt, because tomorrow you will have a talk about diagnostics. So maybe you attend that one tomorrow afternoon, and with Sandra Blome from FLI in Germany, and she will be able to answer to all these questions in a good way.
And they know better than I.
Huh?
They know better than I.
Yeah, so I'll continue. We have a question from David Kalensi. He's asking, how is China currently controlling the spread?
Well, you have to ask Chinese colleagues. I mean, they have a lot of, there's a lot of testing. For example, I mean, there are many measures, and the policy is very complex, and it's been refined and revised many times. I mean, one key element used to be, for example, that everything that goes into the slaughterhouse has to be tested, okay? Where I always wondered how effective that is. I haven't seen data from those activities. The industry is changing also, and government is putting money into investment into other, so that the farms are being set in parts of the country where there are less pigs, but also larger farms. It's hard to get access to the detail, and we don't, as you've seen on the map, we don't have lots of outbreaks, but one has to make the assumption that the virus is present and is still spreading arguably amongst the smaller type of farms. Now, so I mean, that's all I can say. Now, it's better if someone from China were to, I mean, Hong Kong is in China, but somebody from mainland China were to respond to that question.
Thanks. And then we have another one from MD. I don't know who it is, but I read from newspapers and other sources in Asia that small-scale farmers, in example given China and Vietnam, are switching to other production forms.
Yeah, it's absolutely. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you know, I mean, I think this is something that I often kind of talk about. I think the risk with this demand, okay, and the price is, and then I'm talking about even before African swine fever, is that you have opportunists coming in who see a way of making money, haven't got a lot of education, haven't got or training in animal husbandry, set up a small farm just to make money, and those people are also then the ones which are then switching to something else, and that may be bamboo rats or something, or chickens. Okay, and I think this is really where we were a little bit bored. We actually felt, what about if we now end up with, which actually has happened, we end up with a higher poultry density, and as a consequence of that, there is a vaccine against avian influenza, but the vaccination coverage not being high enough, and therefore there could be outbreaks of avian influenza. So you're absolutely right. I mean, they are dynamic, flexible, they would change. The risk is too high, they switch to something different. That doesn't mean that different thing isn't something that doesn't generate a risk.
Thanks. So the MD was Marco Denardi from Safoso. So next question is from Claire Guina. It's a great talk, thanks. Similar question, but related to Vietnam. Do they have a surveillance program implemented?
They do. We've actually worked with them. Claire, I mean, I should say Claire did most of the work. All my smart conclusions, they're based on Claire's PhD, so I have to advertise. Anyway, no, I mean, they do. And they, I mean, amazingly, but I should, again, somebody from Vietnam should talk about that. But I mean, they believe that they can eradicate the disease. I'm skeptical, and they are. We've had discussions with them. They are confident that they are relatively a small proportion of the country is infected now. It's like I say, this is from the Department of Animal Health, which I think is they wouldn't want to exaggerate, I hope, because eventually, I mean, if you set the goal too high and you don't achieve it, it actually fires back. No, like I said, I would be more cautious. I wouldn't set the bar too high, because this virus, and particularly if that was a wild boar source, it would be quite difficult to control. But the response at the moment is they think that most of the communes they have eradicated from them, yeah, or they get no reports. But then they say the surveillance is effective enough for that to be credible.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So we have now, it's 10 o'clock, so we have to round up, but we still have 5 more questions, but we put an end here, but we'll take these 5. So the first, if you have time still, Dirk.
Yeah.
So it's Ekta Patel from ILRI. Are there any governments that have demonstrated good compensation incentives for farmers to report the disease outbreak?
You know, I mean, I would suspect, you see, one thing if you have in China, you have the variation between the provinces. It would be worthwhile to do a study to compare between the different provinces, because they have different policies, which ones work better and which ones didn't work so well. You're right, that's just something that we need to work on. And I would be interested in the details from Vietnam, actually, how well that worked. But you'd have to talk to also then do it as a study where you also talk to the farmers. So I don't have a sort of a clear answer to that question. I think we need to do the work to find out what worked, where, in what circumstances, because I agree with you that lesson is actually important. That's something we can take to other parts of the world.
Thanks. And then from Patrick Bisimwa from DRC, have you investigated any possibility of carrier pigs in Asia or China? Do you know anything about this?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, you.
No.
I mean, it's like with most things. You see, there's so many facets in this story, and at this stage, I don't think that's something, or it doesn't appear to be something that's important. Okay, there's so many other factors which are just human behavior, biosecurity, trucks. Okay, people. Probably still in some parts feeding of pigs well because other pig feed is too expensive and so on. They need to be dealt with first, and then we can get to these other risk factors.
Thanks. We have one from Thomas Dulu. The development of an effective vaccine has been a difficult task. What are the identified stumbling blocks that have compromised the development of a vaccine? So this question will come back to tomorrow, I think, because tomorrow we have talks about vaccine. Or if you want to say something, but otherwise
No,
I think...
No, I mean, as I said in my talk, I mean, I'm a little bit worried about, in some parts, it's like the classic, same with human disease, let's get a vaccine, and the beauty of that is we don't have to change our behaviors. The trouble with this is, let's get the vaccine, but you still have to change your behaviors. And we need to make that clear to the stakeholders.
So from Ferran Hori, as you clearly mentioned, there is minimal information on the role of wildlife in Asia. What is your opinion on the lack of information on wild swine with regards to ASF? Is the situation changing? Are there ongoing efforts on the relevance, interest of developing wildlife surveillance systems in some countries other than South Korea?
Unfortunately not, and arguably it has to do with resources. I mean, we every meeting we go to, we are encouraging to look into the role of wild pigs. But I mean, like I said, the lack of resources probably makes that very hard. But it also has to do with, like in many countries, responsibility, including in China. It's a different government department that deals with wildlife. So there's the political economy also plays a role. But I mean, you're absolutely right. We need to keep reminding, and we need to deal with that issue. And it comes, by the way, it doesn't whether it's pigs and wild pigs, or it's wild animals and coronaviruses and so on. So I think we need to have that One Health approach, which connects between the different government departments.
Thanks. We have 4 more. Fasina is asking about the epidemiology of the disease and says it's becoming more complex with the introduction of new genotypes and the extension into Asia.
That's not something that, again, it doesn't appear to, okay? That doesn't appear to be a role. And there are always people who have the ability and the skills to look into genetic variation, and they would have, if they would have found something, they would have reported it. That virus is a fairly stable virus compared with some other RNA viruses or DNA virus. Big, tough guy.
Then we have a question about the tooth extraction culling method, which is interesting, I think. If there is more information available, is it per house or per pig? Or it seems that if it's per pig, it might have already spread before it was picked up on testing.
It's section of the farm, okay? But it could be pens or so a lot, or parts of a pig shed. So it's not single, and within that, they do testing, okay? So it's groups, actually they're groups of pigs. But it could be less than a shed. And the information is, all I have is that one paper and the discussions we've had with the bigger companies. And this is the mega companies, you see, that are doing this kind of stuff. We have encouraged that we need to have scientific studies to figure out whether this works. And because the risk being that it might actually, the virus might still stay on the farm. But as you can imagine, it's not in the business interest of that farm to continue to have the virus. So anyway, it's not single animals and only taking those out, it's groups of animals and isolating them.
Thanks. And 2 more. So from Covadonga in Spain, how is the evolution of the virus virulence in cases detected in farms? Do you know anything about this?
I don't know anything about it. This is not it's not something that gets a lot of emphasis. So I suspect that there hasn't been enough change to warrant that to be a topic that we need to be concerned about.
And then the last one from Kim Yong-Yung concerns the underreporting of wild boar cases. What is your perspective? You've talked about it a bit, but any last words?
Okay. I would say at this stage where you have such a lot of infection in domestic pigs and the role of wild boar is more of a background factor. The moment you are, like you did in South Korea, you're pushing it down, that's when the wild boar becomes more important, or something that you will be able to deal with. At this stage, it's pig to pig. It's a bit like, it's similar to COVID, you see. Human to human is the most important factor. Whether it's some mustelid species or something in there, that's just a background factor at this stage. But it could change, okay?
So that is the end. So thank you very much. And thank you very much to all the participants and for the questions. I think this has worked very nicely. And thanks, Armanda, again, for organizing this. And for those of you who have registered, we'll see you at 2:45 Central European time this afternoon for, I think it's Michel Dion first, and then Arvo Wiltrop to give you an update on the situation in Africa and Europe. So thanks, Dirk. Thanks a million. Yeah, bye and have a nice day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, bye.
Bye, Tony.